Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Phillip Johnson, engineering and science professor at Thales College. Dr. Johnson has been published in numerous scientific peer-reviewed academic journals. Those include Scientific, the Journal of Applied Sciences, and Combustion and Flame. He received a doctorate in engineering, environment, and chemical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis in 2020. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, in part because Phillip brings together a couple of things that I don't often find. He is incredibly well read in the humanities, particularly in ancient philosophy, and an incredibly skilled engineer. Those two things don't often mix. So we've had a few conversations about how exactly the humanities and engineering relate. What does that have to do with classical education? We both work for a classical education sort of empire at this point. We have K-12 schools, and Phillip is on the college side. And we have a pre-engineering program that is built into our high school program. How exactly does that fit with great books and primary sources and languages? Do engineers actually need to read all the stuff that we tell everyone else they need to read? That and a lot of other things are part of our conversation today. So, Dr. Johnson, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's kick it off with talking about engineering. I'd love to get your thoughts about whether or not there's, in fact, a virtue to engineering. Is this something that really benefits those who master the craft? Is it right to call it a craft or a technique? What would you help us know about engineering?
Sure. So I want to pull from an ancient text to ask this question. I recently, as we were surveying with our students in Physics 1, the history of Greek physics, which leads us to some of our modern ideas about matter and motion, we took an excursion into an ancient Hebrew text. Many people will probably be familiar with the book of Genesis. Within that, I posed the question as we were reading together: is Elohim a physicist or an engineer? And the answer that I think most of the students got and that I advocated for was that there's both. The answer to the physics part has to do with Elohim looking at what was made and saying this is good and reflecting upon it, what he had made. But the engineering side I advocated for came from the fact that he made something, he created. We didn't really explore the anthropological sort of context of what it means to be made in the image as a maker. But I would point out that if you adhere to some of the ideas in that text, and you want to advocate sort of what the divine has done in crafting this great world, making is something that's part of human nature. It's something that we're desirous to do. And while there's many facets of engineering, I think that the one most commonly seen is the idea of making or crafting is the word that you use. And indeed, another myth, Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge, the great creature, is also a craftsman. Is a little bit what we mean by engineer today could go into the design aspect, which is we would think maybe is more of a cognitive process, but there's also the manual aspect with our hands. And we can explore those various themes today. But I would say some of our deepest human myths touch on making things. That's what engineers do. And we can get into some of the details about why each and every one of us does that in some capacity, whether we recognize that or not.
That's fantastic. I had not really thought about that question about whether Elohim is working as a physicist or an engineer, but the question seems very apropos. I mean, you've got all these forces that are in play. I'm sure you could do sort of a more physics-oriented reading of Genesis 1 with concern about light, with forces, with what does it mean to separate these different things, and how do you establish those boundaries and keep them firm. As you were describing, it took me back to Tolkien's essay on subcreation. He titled that "On Fairy Stories," but he develops that whole theory of really what authors are doing when they write books is they're mimicking their creator. They are sub-creators underneath his lordship, but he makes a similar argument about literary efforts, that there's something really profoundly human about creating a different world, which I think is really interesting, that you're taking a similar idea but applying it to the actual physical world in a way that really is what the engineer is all about. Is that correct? Am I following your line of thinking?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's establishing order in a chaotic world. And similar to what you're saying, you that's a fascinating point you made, and you could probably extend this analogy further, that just as you can have you can spew all kind of nonsense, you could even make it flowery or poetic. Similarly, there is bad science. There are bad scientific ideas that don't work. Bad in the sense that the theories don't work, and then there's the ethical bad. Um, but if you do it correctly, you are establishing order and bringing goodness. So just as a good poem would transmit information, I'm using a technical word. Maybe we would say bestow ideas to make it perhaps a little more flowery. But you're still transmitting a good idea from one to the other, and that medium is also part of the craft. So similarly, with engineering, you are transmitting either some kind of energy or some type of mechanical force, hopefully to a good aim. And that entire process of crafting that network is establishing order in the chaotic, unformed matter, if you will.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump to maybe a slightly more contemporary question. If there is if engineering helps us to be creative and to create in a really nuanced way, I want to get your thoughts on technology, because of course we live the distance between when Plato was writing the Timaeus, or when Archimedes was figuring out some of the earliest principles of physics, or when Aristotle was writing the physics. The distance in time is vast, but also the distance in technological capability is enormous. We have the capacity to do things that the ancients would never have imagined being able to do without lots and lots of slave labor. We have lots of machines that can do that for us today. But I'm curious if you think this kind of technological development is actually a good thing. I'm thinking particularly in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of buzz about the new Chat GPT program. And I saw an article last Friday in the Atlantic that was arguing that generative AI is going to be the next industrial revolution, and that it's really coming for white collar jobs, and that technology is now poised to put lots and lots of highly educated people who are trained in very precise technical kinds of writing. Those folks' jobs may be on the chopping block, since they can be automated in a pretty impressive way at this point. So technological development seems to be happening, and certainly has been happening for a long time. What are your thoughts? Is this really a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this even the right register to consider technological development?
Yeah, so I would probably distinguish this question with, how does technology affect the individual, and then how does it affect collective humanity that then turns around into the individual. So when you were mentioning these ancient folks, and you know this well, Josh, that even with Plato, there was criticism of technology for it making weakening of men. Writing, the style of writing makes us be able to use our skills of oration less so, or these practitioners of Homer memorization, right? Some of these people that could sing the entire Homeric epic. There may be somebody out there that can still do this. I am sure that there is somebody who loves ancient Greek so much that they could probably quote the entire Homeric epic. But there probably were more people that could do that in ancient Greece. So has it weakened us? Possibly. And possibly that there's some extent to where the part of humanity that is encapsulated in our bodies, including our soul, which I would say is incorporeal, but our identity with the bounds of our bodies, that probably has less power than our ancient forebears. A lot of what our powers lie in now is external. But even again, those ancients recognize this. So I love Plato's retelling of the Prometheus myth in the Protagoras dialogue. Within that, he actually frames technology as the gift that the gods gave us because we didn't have anything else. So Epimetheus makes the creatures, the beasts of the world that have claws and fangs and other sharp objects or brute strength, but he left us weak. We have skin rather than fur. We don't have these claws, and our stature is of only certain size. So Prometheus has to come and steal fire from the gods and give it to us. And that's what makes us strong. What's fascinating about that myth is that it almost begins to blur the line of what is external to humans and what's internal to us and our identity shaping. And then finally, within that, and this is, what probably most would recognize, what makes humans so powerful is that we can transmit that technology from generation to generation. So this is where I didn't anticipate invoking Richard Dawkins this morning, but meme theory, he invented the idea of memes, believe it or not. Not just, strange images you post on the internet, but the idea that it's our concepts that we can transmit from generation to generation, so that each youngling does not have to relearn the entire world. They can just be told things, and we can pass on the technology. And that's how progress happens, and that's what makes us so strong. Technology technology has been with humans for a long time. If you talk about it in its primitive aspect, fire is technology, or even things such as music and language. Is language an artifact of humanity, or is it something inherent within us? I think all of those things, we would say it's an external, internal sort of thing. Words go out from our bodies, but they're part of the human experience, and I think that we can claim for them to be ours. So I do think there's an argument to say that as an individual, if you look at the limit of our bodies, we probably have less strength, less fortitude than our forebears. But if you include that externality, we are stronger. So then what does that do to the collective? I think the answer to your question is probably buried within how you posed it, right? There is still manual labor. I think in America, we don't see some of the brutality that it can be. There are hard jobs. There are tough circumstances. I think the toughest circumstances have probably been offshore to other parts of the world. So I'm not going to say that it is easy for everybody right now, but there is a sense that the tide has risen all boats, perhaps in some capacity. And we would probably need to go down this line further and distinguish, medical advancement versus machine advancement versus other sort of comforts. But that's where I'll start with. And what do you say? Do you have a contrary opinion on this about the strength of technology?
I don't know that I have a contrary opinion. I mean, I'm a reluctant user of all the technology. I mean, obviously, what we're doing right now is a technological endeavor. We're speaking across about 35 miles away from each other. We're recording this over an amorphous web nebulous thing called the internet. I'm using a camera and a mic. I assume you're using some version of the same. And this is going to be distributed to handheld devices all over the world through the podcasting platform. All of that's really cool. I think it just takes me back to a section of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he kind of frames technology as something that promises you individual freedom, but there is a lie buried in the promise. Like, you do get those greater capacities that you're talking about. The trouble is that Lewis argues every individual thinks he owns those capacities. Just because I can get on a plane and I can defeat the natural distances at great speed, and I can go from here to London in less than 12 hours, does not mean I have the actual capability of flying myself without someone else's aid. So he makes the argument that all of our technologies, what they carry with them is handing over control of those different capacities to someone else. And that then kind of casts this in the realm of economic trade-offs, in my mind. I mean, it becomes a matter of, do we want to limit so to put it in the education space, do we want to limit education to only what can occur when a group of students are physically within earshot of an actual teacher? Maybe there are times that the answer is yes. Maybe there are times that the answer is no, and we do want to say, okay, then we're going to record this lecture. We're going to platform it and stream it as often as possible and get the word out. But there is, at the same time, so there's a difference between trying to use technology wisely and being so technophilic that we don't question what is the cost of using this technology. I want to kind of see if we can take this towards another area you mentioned. You mentioned the soul earlier, and the soul being within the body. And we do need to get back to engineering at some point, but I have a feeling this will all connect by the time we're done talking today. How do you see, so if what we've laid out so far is that technology is a potential good, but that potential good requires us to use it, that it's multiplying our external factors, but we're using that motivated by the internal factors, which I assume is somehow related to the soul. Do you see that does that technology have any kind of reciprocal way of shaping the soul, or is technology just something that a body soul fused person can use? How do you see the soul relating to technological capabilities?
Yeah, I do think that it certainly shapes us. Um, Although to invoke that abolition of man, there's a couple fascinating lines. So he mentions, Lewis mentions within that, not just kind of scientific power, but also the effect of mass propaganda, which is, mind blowing that he's writing this, I don't know, 60 years ago.
Yep.
What would he have thought about the promulgation of ideas through social media? And so maybe he would look at that and say, this is exactly what I was talking about. I would say that, science, that the technology that we have developed through smartphones, through electronic communications, has in some sense facilitated ideas. Are the ideas scientific? Are ideas technology? And this is why I was almost preemptively mentioning things like rhetoric, poetry, music as also forms of technology, because we can ask this question: do smartphones shape us? I think so. I think that those that have developed algorithms that want to hack dopamine pathways are very in tune with what it can do to our soul. And so there is that side of it. But in some sense, I don't know if this problem doesn't go back much further. Ancients that were developing poetry and theater as propaganda, whether they even knew it was propaganda or not, were going towards similar aims. If I want to have influence in the ancient world, if I want to communicate an idea, I want other human beings to hear that idea, or to maybe get emotionally attached to a character in a comedy or a tragedy, and then let their reflection upon that change how they think. So in some sense, even some of the most ancient things that we do that we don't think about as sciencey, that is soul shaping. Any communication we have as humans is soul shaping. And so it's really unavoidable. I mean, being in this world, we are shaped by many things. I think, to me, the question of technology is really to what capacity, to what power. And this is what I think Lewis is right to point out. This may not be a new kind of shaping, but in terms of degree of shaping, it is far more intense. And science has facilitated that. I can agree. For good or for ill. I think it could go either way. I think that in the hands of good people, the shaping that we could do is good. And I mean, this is where you look at institution. This may bother some people, but if you look at, say, the idea of the church as an institution to promulgate ideas, I would say that those that are adherents of it would say that it is more than that. But I think it's okay to say that it does do that. It promulgates ideas. It is powerful. The institutional church is more powerful than just a collection of individuals walking around. And that also shapes people in a powerful way. And I would advocate strongly that the development of the institutional church has been good for the world. That may be contagious in our days, but nonetheless, that is something, an outgrowth, something that's stronger than perhaps what we would say is primitive. Debatable, but let's go with it. Primitive. That has grown in our capacity to shape and mold, and that's been good. So yes, the answer is yes. The more the technology we have, the stronger our shaping can be. But it can be good. It can be bad, though.
So if I'm fascinated by attempts to define technology, because I think it's one of those words that we use a lot, but it's very rare that I hear people slow down and actually work through. I mean, etymologically, of course, you've got a techne, which is somehow different from an art, but that's where we get our word technique. But there are arts that make use of techniques, but then you've also got the logos part, and etymologically, we've got some sort of study of an art gives us. But in function, a technology, I think, is much closer to how you've been using it as sort of an intentional extension of our internal capacities into an external world. And so that technology is going to multiply our human efforts. And technology, of course, is a massive increase. It massively increases productivity and efficiency. I think if those things are then governed by the sort of wisdom that you're encouraging us to consider, I think that technology can often be a great thing that really helps us do the work that we're called to do that much better. I want to see if we can kind of bend this back around towards engineering. And I wanted to ask you for your thoughts on kind of two different models of an engineer. And maybe if you could help us both understand what those models are and then which one, if one of them is preferable over the other, what are they? And that'll hopefully kind of bring this together. One vision would be an engineer as a scientist, and another would be an engineer as a technologist. How would you describe those two views, and do you have a preference for one of those over the other?
In some sense, the reason why we're having this conversation is partly due to the success of science. If you think back, if you read accounts in the ancient world of what an engineer is, it's someone that makes engines. And engines almost always meant engines of war. I'm probably going to blend my medieval and ancient technologies, but trebuchets, scorpions, catapults, these sort of things, these siege towers that you read about. They built these, and is there a science to it? We would look at that today and maybe use science in the term in the colloquial use of the term, but as a science, as a sort of sure knowledge, not so. Ancient engineers, it was a lot of manual, hands-on labor. It was a lot of trial and error because we did not have scientific theories, scientific models robust enough to be able to predict how something was to behave. I mean, our model was the experiment. You build this, I can sling a large rock yay far. Well, let's try to tweak the design. Now I can sling it further. And it's more potent. And you get into, there's many hallmarks of modernity. One of them has to do with gunpowder. This is why we don't have city walls anymore. You can blast through the walls of Constantinople in 1453 because some engineer, a Hungarian engineer, was paid enough to make some huge gun that could blast through the walls. And there are many casualties to these engineers in that period. A lot of it had to do with explosives, things going awry. This still happens in the engineering of warfare. But it's a lot of trial and error. And meanwhile, science is kind of growing in its own capacity. And it's really, I don't think people recognize this, but it is really the turn of the 20th century that we really can have something that we would call STEM today, where we say, these are the scientific principles, these are the mathematical models. If I construct this environment, a fluid will behave in such a way that I can predict it. And because I can predict it, I can manipulate it to do such and such. Especially in the field of fluid dynamics, this union probably doesn't happen until 1905. The science behind it was puzzled until we came up with a development what's called a boundary layer. I can get into the details of what happens with flow over a body, but there's this area, like if you immerse a sphere in a body of water, there's this flow around it, and we can sort of treat the flow in a certain distance away from that object with some high level theory that we've known about for some time. But at that object itself, where the fluid kind of drags across it, there's a dissipation. The flow will separate off of it, and that's very detailed. And it takes it took a significant amount of experimentation to figure that out. And so that's 1905. We normally date that Theodore von Karman with a boundary layer. If you think about from there to today, where we can have an engineer or a team of engineers sit at a computer and fire up a simulation that has millions and millions, billions of computations done on this sort of grid, and it's figuring out the way the fluid behaves at each node. And they can use that to design and tweak and modify an airplane wing so that you can, before you even get to prototyping, you can say, we think that the fluid's going to behave this way. And then you make the prototype and build it. This would be as opposed to that model of engineering that I mentioned before, where you have to build an airplane and it'll fly or it won't. And then you go back to the drawing board. The capacity to design is new. And so this is a question. In some sense, engineers, even in the academy, they struggle with this of where is the line between applied science and technology making. I think engineers have to wear both hats because of the world that we live in today. So with science, and once you kind of get into what's called applied science, you are kind of aiming towards technology. But there is a science aspect and there's a technology aspect, and those, I would say, have different aims. But I would go all the way back to the beginning of our talk and say both of these can be good.
Mm.
Reflecting on nature, it's not often done with how we teach engineering, but reflecting on nature and its goodness, its orderliness as a soul shaping sort of exercise is something that should be done. But even the making, the technological crafting, I think there's a virtue to that. And if we have time in this talk, we can explore the virtue ethics of making something out of science as well. So again, I'm giving you long-winded answers. I'm hoping that within them there's enough to pick up.
I think so, and that's a great answer. And this is an area so far outside of my expertise. I appreciate your insight to that. I didn't realize how new the design element was. That's really interesting, and it certainly sounds a lot more. Not to bring everything back to dollars and cents, but it sounds a lot more cost effective to have an accurate design and then make a model and then test the model and be like, 90% of this works. Let's tweak this last 10%, rather than sort of I'm kind of remembering the Monty Python and the Holy Grail movie where when they get to there's that scene where they try to have their own version of the Trojan horse. They make a rabbit, and one of the knights is like, and then Lancelot and this other guy and I will all jump out. And they realize, oh, we forgot that the key part is to put the guys in there, and the whole thing fails. Rather than having engineering run through that sort of process, where
Right.
when you can spend months and months on a siege engine design that just doesn't work. So that's really interesting.
Sure, yeah, and it depends on the application. There are some things I'm sure where it is a lot more just let's build it, tweak it, add this part. But I cited an airplane example for a reason. Airplanes are somewhat expensive to build per item, and so as with the price point, so you'll have more incentive to design well ahead of time.
Well, with that idea in mind, or kind of that vision of engineering, because that doesn't seem like those are really opposed. But you said engineers really need to be able to. There's an applied science. There's an eye towards current technological direction. Like all of that's in there. How many engineers does society need? And I ask that in part because I remember asking my advisor in college if I should go get a PhD, and his default answer was no,
Yeah.
because and the early in the this was would have been 2011. At that point in time, there were roughly 300 applicants for 20 nationwide jobs in humanities and the PhD world. And over the last 10 years in education, there has been such a push for STEM, also for women to be in STEM. And just we need STEM, we need more engineers, we need more people in engineering.
Yeah.
And I'm at least a little worried that we may very well flood the engineering market in the next 10 to 15 years after a 20-year societal push to throw any kid with a math aptitude into a STEM class and tell him, God put you on this earth to be an engineer, so get to engineering. What are your thoughts on that? How many engineers do we actually need?
Yeah, so I will say if you want a number, that's going to be above my pay grade. So I won't give you a number. But I think the question you're asking, yeah, is about guidance. So again, another two-pronged answer. I think on the individual level, I have no regrets personally from studying engineering. So I enjoyed math and physics in high school. I wanted to do something humanitarian after college. I did not intend on becoming an academic. And so I wanted to go and do as part of my undergraduate education. I ended up spending some time in North Africa. We put some like solar panel powered water pumps that would pump water to a local school and kind of a rural village among the Berber peoples. And I could kind of see how that played out. And so I was going to utilize that, these sort of high-minded ideals that I mentioned of like, you can do science and reflect upon the order of nature within the engineering discipline, that came later as part of it. And so I give that briefly, and I could expound on that, but I don't think that if any of your students that love mathematics and physics study engineering and they study it in the right context will regret it. There are ways to study engineering that is kind of and it is kind of the crass caricature. It's like, how do I manipulate nature? What's the minimum amount of information I need to perform this manipulation? I don't want to reflect. I don't want to consider what I'm doing in the world, and its impacts. That can be done, and can have negative soul formation, most certainly. And unfortunately, and this kind of gets to the second part of the question you're asking, is how many does society? I think unfortunately there are members of society that want that. I think back to when I was coming out of graduate school, I was applying for an R&D position at a large company, and I had to fill out this personality survey. And a lot of the questions were things like, I guess there's, are you nice to work with sort of questions, but a lot of them were, when you come to a design question or a moment in the process, do you kind of go off and rogue with your own ideas? Do you try to innovate, or do you kind of, stick with marching orders? And again, I'm caricaturing what the two polls were. It was worded in a much more fluid way, but that's essentially what I was asking is, can you obey orders, or do you want to do your own thing? And I was like, I want to do my own thing. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an innovator. I don't know if I passed that test. I didn't get that job. Maybe they had another applicant. Who knows? Who knows why I didn't get the job? There's a million reasons why you don't get a job. But I've always wondered if I failed that test because what they wanted was someone, with a certain intelligence level that could solve technical problems, but they didn't want to ask any questions. They didn't want you to ask, what are the ramifications of building this technology? What does it mean for human health? I don't want to go in full dark mode of saying that there was something nefarious at work with this particular application. But I wouldn't put it past certain individuals in society that want the technological capacity without the questioning. And I think that could be bad, which is why it's important. And this is one of the things we want to do here at Thales College. And I want to see more, and there's already places doing this, but I want to see more of this in the engineering community, is using science as a reflection of the goodness of nature to develop virtue in the soul, but then also considering the larger ethical ramifications of society, of what we do. And this is part of a lot of like the codes of what engineers say. This is, the ABET accreditation board. This is an important point to them. What are our impacts in society? A lot of people talk about this, but sometimes it doesn't always come out in the way we educate. And so, again, the short answer is, for the individual, it's good that they can be taught well. They can be taught poorly, but they can be taught well. I don't think they can have regrets for engineering if they're taught well. And then in terms of society, we can use more. It can be used to develop the kind of systems that C.S. Lewis fears, but it can also be developed for good. Engineers are problem solvers, and even if they don't use their training to solve the particular type of problems, if they're not building airplanes or heat exchangers, they can still solve problems. Engineers go off and do lots of things. We now have engineers that are politicians. And you can give comment maybe about whether you should look at a political problem the way an engineer would. But it's, in some sense, it's a card to just say I can solve problems.
The only comment I'll make there is that I am very suspicious of any politician who claims to be able to solve problems. If I would be much happier if we lived in a world where, whether they were engineers or not, if our politicians said, there's a giant problem and I have a solution to about 5% of that giant problem, I think that would be a much more realistic approach. Well, Philip, you kind of hit on three of the things that I wanted to kind of tie into as we are wrapping up here. So I want to tell me if you would agree with this. It seems to me that you've hit on a great connection to one of my remaining questions about what exactly does engineering have to do with a classical education. I'm pretty sure, if I'm following you correctly, that the connection is really that engineering flows from the way we try to shape the souls of our students. And whether that's happening in a high school context or collegiate context or graduate context, education is really about formation. It's about helping people become who they are becoming, to wax a little Kierkegaardian for a moment. But that you've told us that really the goodness of the engineer and of the engineering's process really depends on a right understanding of human nature, of scientific nature, and of the nature of the technological processes that are being used, which suggests to me that this seems to be the connection between why you have a love of what most people would classify as two very different things. The engineer who can solve my current contemporary bridge problem, and the classics major who has read every ancient Greek philosopher. It seems to me that the engineer, to really be able to be that effective, evaluative kind of person you're describing, who maybe big companies aren't really that interested in. I think you may be onto something, that larger corporations are more interested in folks who will simply do what they are told rather than really weigh, is this the best way to get there? But that kind of engineer needs to be a student of human nature, and that's the realm of the humanities. So that really engineering and the humanities have a lot more in common than I would have initially thought. Is that what's your response to all of that?
Yeah, I think so. And so if you want to get back to classical education as making someone free and cultivating virtue. So just as, and this is the theme of the day, just as competence in rhetoric will actually make you, there's a point to say you actually are more virtuous if you're better at rhetoric. If you have good ideas and you're promulgating good ideas, the better you are as a rhetorician, there's more virtue there, because you can shape the world for better than if you didn't study it and were poor at it. So similarly, having this technological capacity, you are doing good things. So we may look at things such as the provision of food and the comfort of homes. I would say that virtue lies beyond material goods. I think that's important. That's debatable. Some people say that that's part of it, but I say it's beyond that. However, the distribution of those goods is a good thing. So as a father, I have children. I want them to be fed. I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel comforted. I don't want them to be cold in the winter. And me as a father, I can provide that. Collectively as engineers, we have provided that better for the world. And so in some sense, if you say that, virtue is doing good, you're actually participating in a grander exercise is by tapping into that power if you use it well. And so that those kind of gifts that engineering has brought to us are good things from the charity of giving it. So again, if I'm putting virtue in the soul rather than in the goods, I would note that the charity of giving those goods is itself virtuous. And so you are aspiring to virtue by crafting this technology if it is used well, and you're making humans more free to do things that we couldn't do in the past. So.
Excellent. Well, Philip, I've got two last questions for you as we try to draw this to a close. You're in such an exciting position at Thales College. I'm really interested to see kind of how that experiment works out over in the coming years. And you are literally building the engineering program from the ground up. So I did want to take a moment and just ask you to describe the engineering program at Thales College. It is possible, I don't know really who is watching this or listening to it, but it's possible that we have a 16, 17, or 18-year-old who's thinking, man, tell me more about Thales College engineering. So if that was the scenario, could you walk us through your program, and why should somebody come to Thales College and study engineering with you?
Right. Yeah. So there's two main things. There's some very unique aspects about the college in terms of just its affordability and its speed. That's a side point. But the engineering program properly, the two sort of main branches that I harp on is one. It has to do with the theme of today's talk. Is that there is an integration into some of the history and philosophy of our various disciplines and fields of study that you will arguably not get elsewhere. I've been around different hubs of engineering in like liberal arts colleges, and there's some people that do things well. So I don't want to say we're only doing this, but this is going to be a special case for us to think about. When we look at fluid flow, or the way that electricity flows through a circuit board, can you abstract that and say that there is something deep in nature about what causes forces to move flows? Can you make analogies between that and what you also see in other aspects of the world, maybe even sociological phenomena? And then what does that mean of looking at the entire cosmos in an orderly fashion? Is there an order to the world? Is there a way to look at science as more than just the uncaused forces colliding with atoms, or is there a harmony to it? And so I want to bring that back into each and every aspect of the subdisciplines and all the courses that we're looking at, in the hopes that it will help to cultivate that and make virtuous engineers. The second aspect is that a lot of what we are doing in terms of the exercises, the laboratory aspects, are put into an industrial environment to solve real world complex problems. There's a couple reasons for that. Some of them practical in the sense that if you're going to be doing internships you'll be getting an income gain that can then pay back your college funding. So the idea of being debt free, and again, we want to be free. That's the liberal and liberal the liberal arts, and as part of classical education, you want to be free, but there's also this freeing aspect of how you learn. So, I've spent a lot of time in the engineering education world, some more than me, but one of the criticisms I would point out is how we teach is this sort of almost operational sort of follow these steps. The world is complex. It's full of complex problems. There are powerful techniques that engineers use, such as analysis, breaking down a complex problem into its parts, solving them individually. We do that well. We don't always piece it back together into wholes well. I want to do that, but also just being immersed in complex problems and then looking at things holistically. And so by being in an industrial real world environment of seeing the bigger picture, and then also by studying science with that in mind of saying, hey, actually science is an area where people argue about ideas. And you have to kind of piece together your vision of the world. Being able to think like that comprehensively, after being able to be trained in analysis, is something that I want to bring into engineering education. And so if you come and hang out with us at Thales College, you'll be a part of something new and fresh. I know that other people in the engineering community are excited about this. And so it'll be fun. That's my pitch.
That's a great pitch, and it's really exciting to kind of see the infrastructure being built and the program happening. I know you've got real students this year, which is so exciting. There have been dual enrolled high school students for a couple of years with Thales College now, but to have the first class of actual college students and to get to work with them and move classes from a blueprint on a laptop screen or in a binder to a real course with experiments and lab time and connections and all of the things that go with that is just really exciting. Last question for you, Dr. Johnson. If you could imagine for me an 18-year-old student who feels, or at least has a strong background in physics and calculus, and thinks, you know what, engineering is probably where I want to go. What should that student look at in evaluating different engineering programs? Or should engineering be a master's level thing and get a general bachelor's degree? Or what general college advice for that aspiring, good at calculus, good at physics, high school senior? How would you advise that student?
So I would say, and I'll draw from my own experience here, engineering programs anywhere are going to be rigorous. And the amount of credit hours required are going to be intense. And in some sense, that prevents some people from studying other things, either in extracurriculars or taking electives or whatnot. I would say be prepared, because it will be challenging, but also find ways to continue to develop yourselves. Part of that will be the environment that you're in. So again, if in life you say, I just want a good major that can show I'm smart enough to solve hard problems and I can make a certain amount of money and be happy, as many people live those lives and are satisfied with it. If you want more, then look at different aspects of the program. What are they teaching? What is the culture like? How focused are the faculty? And I don't want to be overly critical of my field, but there are some schools where sometimes the faculty are kind of caught up in their research, and the teaching will be passed off to instructors. Some schools are fixing this by hiring teaching faculty that are more invested in the teaching aspects. But I would look at how focused are the personnel in teaching, and then like I said, the environment and what are the goals of the program. If you want something more, if you want something to reflect on the world and to think deeply about your impacts within it. Some of those programs do things better than others. That has to do with the school culture. That could be program specific. It's hard. There's so many institutions of higher ed out there. It's hard without me calling out names to point out. But there are generally good people in our field. Like all fields, there's a mix of people that are just doing it for a career, and then there are people that care for the world. Find good people. People I think sometimes think that engineers are of a certain caricature. We're almost Spock-like in our rationality. Some there's some cases where the caricature is true. Even those people, though, talk to them. Just talk to people. Even the Spotlight characters got into engineering for a reason, and sometimes you'll be surprised at what their aspirations were. So just do your research, and it's about the people that will shape your time there. And I think that your best physics and mathematics students are already like that. That they will, if they are interested in STEM, they probably had good STEM educators. I know I was inspired by some great high school teachers, and let those influences guide you into programs and meeting other good people.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Johnson. This has been a delightful conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot about the way engineering works and how it all fits together. So thank you for joining me today.
Fantastic. I've been blessed to be on here.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Phillip Johnson, engineering and science professor at Thales College. If you want to know more about Thales College, check out thalescollege.org. That's THALES college.org. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. The Optimistic Curmudgeon is a project of Thales Press. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. You can find us on 3 major social media platforms. Search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon on Facebook and LinkedIn, and find us on Twitter at the handle @TheOptimisticC3. This episode was edited and produced by Madison Kay, audio engineer for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.